It's February of 2021, and as of today, nobody seems to want to admit what actually caused the Texas blackout. Since the temperature dropped in mid-February, Texas has been experiencing its worst power shortage in its history. Homes and businesses are frozen, pipes are bursting, and nobody seems to agree on where to place the blame. The discussion in the news has been mostly political. The liberals are blaming deregulation, while the conservatives are mocking renewable energy and iced-up windmills. I think that both sides are wrong in this case and largely miss the fundamental reason why we have power grids in the first place. And so I want to take some time to explain how a power grid works and the overarching reasons of why the grid in Texas failed. The first thing you need to know is that electricity has the shortest shelf life of anything humans have ever produced. It literally has to be consumed the moment it is created. Once the generating station creates the current, it has to be consumed somewhere by something. Now this is different than, say, the grocery store, where products are produced at a farm or factory, stored on the shelf for a certain period of time, and then bought and consumed by you and I. There can be a lag of weeks or months between the creation and consumption of food. Another example is your city water supply. Your tap water likely comes from a network of wells or other sources. Those wells can only supply so much water per minute. And when everyone turns on their showers simultaneously in the morning, the pumps don't suddenly run faster to make up for the spike in demand. The solution to this issue is storage. The wells pump a steady flow of new water into tanks and reservoirs that hold enough storage to supply at least a day's worth of water. As the demand rises and falls throughout the day, the tank is able to absorb the changes in demand while the supply remains roughly the same. This principle of storage along the supply chain exists everywhere. We use it in consumer electronics, building supplies, fuel distribution. Even squirrels store food to feed their demand when the supply gets low in the winter. It's possible that the only mass-produced product that doesn't have any buffer system is electricity. There's no Amazon fulfillment center for municipal power. There are no giant backup batteries that can power entire cities. We have yet to invent a way for large amounts of electricity to be stored for later use. The closest thing we have is pumped storage hydro, but that's for a different video. For now, just remember that all electricity has to be supplied the moment the demand needs it. As the demand for electricity goes up, the supply has to rise with it. As the demand goes down, the supply must drop, up and down 2 or 3 times a day, every day. That's what a power grid does, balance the supply to match the demand. The second thing you need to know is that, like most things in life, there's safety in numbers. Just like car insurance spreads out the risk across millions of drivers, the power grid allows us to manage the risk involved in supplying power to millions of users in real time. Imagine for a moment that there was no grid, just your home. Just you and whatever electricity you choose to use. Every time you switch on a light, the small generator that powers your house would need a little more fuel. Every time you use your washing machine, you'd have to make sure to bring more power online to match the need. If you don't, the supply isn't sufficient to meet demand and the entire system fails. Likewise, every time you switch off a light, your generator has to reduce its output. Otherwise, you're producing too much power and major damage will be done, putting everyone in danger. This back and forth would be impractical on a home-by-home basis, and it's still challenging on a neighborhood-by-neighborhood basis. But it gets far easier when you link cities, states, even entire time zones into the same grid. As the overall demand increases every evening, grid operators monitor the demand minute by minute and spin up additional power to match it. Because the current is spread across thousands of miles of transmission lines, the slight variations are barely detectable. When we spread the load to millions of households, businesses, and industries, we're able to share the risk, matching supply and demand in real time. Now let's talk for a moment about what this looks like on the supply side. As it turns out, every power source has a different set of rules for turning them on and off. Hydropower can usually be activated the fastest. Petroleum-based systems like gas and oil take a little longer but can generally be powered up in 30 to 90 minutes. And large furnaces like coal and nuclear can take several hours to an entire day to go from a cold start. Now let's factor in renewables like wind and solar. Now, I'm not making any judgment about the politics or wisdom of investing in these types of power, but I think everyone can see that you can't always count on it being a sunny and windy day right when you need it to be. Even worse, our 3-phase alternating current standard of transmission has a tendency to fade over long distances, making it difficult when your supply and demand are located thousands of miles apart. All these variables introduce risk, and the best way to mitigate risk is to spread it out. Now, the Western power grid has an interesting way of handling this issue. It's no secret that there are more people living in Southern California than in the Pacific Northwest, but the PNW has a surplus of clean, fast energy in the form of hydroelectric power. To bridge the gap between supply and demand, a dedicated set of power lines called the Pacific Intertie links the Columbia River to the outskirts of Los Angeles through an 850-mile-long direct current route. When millions of people turn on their air conditioners in LA, power from the Northwest is there to meet the demand. Now, let's look at some history. In the 1920s, most power in America came in the form of small local utilities who produced just enough electricity for a single town or city. Scalability was a big issue, as most utilities didn't have the money to extend service outside their region. And many power systems used different standards of voltage and phase from each other, making it difficult to connect to neighboring power lines. President Roosevelt changed all that with the Rural Electrification Act of 1936. This New Deal-era legislation offered cheap loans to utilities for expanding to rural areas in exchange for larger service areas and consistent electrical standards. You know how you can use the same phone charger with the same outlet prongs anywhere in the US? This law from 1936 is part of the reason why. Without an incentive to get on the same standard, it's likely that utilities today would still have regional exceptions to our nationwide 110-volt system. The Rural Electrification Act forever set the trajectory for how we would manage power in North America. It got everyone on the same page with voltage, amperage, and a 60-cycle alternating current. As the new grids spread out from the cities, they eventually met in the middle, roughly on the edge of the Great Plains, leading to the near universal interconnectedness we see today. Everyone, that is, except for Texas. The US Constitution explicitly gives the federal government authority to govern matters that exist between the states. Therefore, if you don't go outside state lines, you can often stay outside of federal rules. For whatever reason, Texas chose to exercise that right from the beginning of its power system. And today, the majority of Texas is run as a totally separate grid with almost no connection to its neighbors. Now, I'm sure at the time this seemed like a good idea. After all, Texas is large, and self-sufficiency is a good strategy in most cases. But remember, electricity is the only thing that cannot be stored for later, and unlike other self-sufficient goods like food and fresh water, there's no option to store electricity in big underground bunkers. You must connect with your neighbors or bear all the risk yourself. Compared to the other grids, Texas really isn't all that big after all. I think it's worth noting here that there is no California grid or New York grid. No other state manages its own power system independent of its neighbors, which means it was incredibly risky for Texas to do this. Not because self-sufficiency is bad, it just doesn't apply when a resource cannot be stored. At the end of the day, electricity doesn't care what state you're from, who's in the White House, or how badly you want to avoid the federal government. Power grids are all about sharing risk. The smaller your grid, the more likely you're going to experience capacity issues. I believe that no amount of renewable energy sources would have prevented this disaster from happening. And no amount of regulation would have guaranteed the lights would have stayed on. The best thing Texas can do is the same thing that we all would do if we were to run out of sugar or flour in the middle of baking a cake. Go next door and ask if we could borrow some. Thanks for watching.
As many Texans enter their second or third day without power, with no definitive end in sight, some are questioning how such a widespread meltdown is even possible. The answer lies with Texas's energy grid.
Thanks so much for watching. I'm not an actual engineer. I just like to talk about engineering in videos. And so if anyone out there with experience in power systems or electrical engineering has anything to add or correct, please let me know down in the comments. If you're interested in learning more about the history of the Western power grid, I highly recommend this book. It's about the history of the Bonneville Power Administration. It's from 1985, but it fills in a lot of the history of how local power systems progressed from the early Edison days through the New Deal, all the way to the modern grid we have today. I can't recommend it enough.